right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, and welcome to this C20 panel on financial inclusion and the civil society sector, how civil society organizations are or are not indeed able to access financial services. This is a C20 panel. The C20 panel is the civil society group under the G20 that brings the concerns of civil society organizations, more than 1,000 civil society organizations currently signed up with the C20, and serves as a panel to bring the concerns of those organizations and indeed everyone who wants to be involved to the leaders of the G20. As I said, we're here today to talk about financial inclusion and non-profit organizations and civil society organizations. This has already been a long-standing concern that certainly at the policy level has been recognized for many years now. It is clear that both measures to address money laundering and financing terrorism have sometimes overshot and led to many organizations being unable to access needed funds. But as I said, already for some years now, both the Financial Action Task Force and others have tried to address this. In 2012, the FATF, when changing its methodology for evaluating country, particularly pointed out to assessors whether measures that were being taken were disrupting legitimate NPO activity. And that is something that assessors need to take into account when they look at how a country is implementing AML-CFT measures. And then there was a wider change in 2016 that undoubtedly will be addressed by other speakers as well, in when language in the international standard on AML-CFT that NPOs were supposedly particularly vulnerable was removed, and it was recognized that there isn't a particular vulnerability of non-profits to the financing of terrorism. And I think that the overall sort of change of hearts, at least at the policy level, and this has not yet trickled down to the operational level, to the practical level, and I think that's why we're here to discuss it today. But I think that that sort of change in attitude is very well reflected in one line that I want to quote to you from the UK's anti-money laundering assessment from 2017, in which it says the following: while the risks in the sector are unchanged, government and law enforcement agencies have conducted significant work since their earlier risk assessment to increase understanding of the sector and the risks it faces around terrorist financing. In comparison to the overall size of the sector, the amount of known abuse is very low. It is unlikely that charities have been set up for the purpose of funding of terrorism. As such, we now assess the risk of abuse of NPOs altogether low. And so it makes it clear, it's not that anything particularly has changed in the sector, it's that we have changed our understanding. And again, I think that understanding and how that trickles down is something that we're struggling with. We at the World Bank have developed a methodology to help countries assess in detail where are the risks in the sector so that you get proportional implementation of measures and not paint the whole the whole sector with the same brush. But of course, there are lots of other solutions as well, including technological, what banks are doing, what NPOs are doing. And that's why we're here today, to talk about, not to really rehash the problem. I think we can all be on the same page as far as the problem is concerned, but we're here particularly to discuss possible solutions and ways forwards. When it comes to this panel in particular, just as a matter of housekeeping and how we will run this panel, we will, in a moment, I will hand over to Her Excellency Princess Noof, the C20 Chair, to give some words of introduction. I will then, after that, hand over to Leah van Broekhoven from the Human Security Collective to set the scene for our discussion today. Then we will have two civil society organizations, the United Peace Organization and Islamic Relief Worldwide, intervene to give a bit more detail on the problems they're experiencing, but also particularly what they are doing to address that. Then we have a bank, Ruben Zandvliet from the ABN AMRO. Then we will talk a bit about technological solutions, what can be done on that front. Mata Lakritz from TechSoup. Then the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, Mariam Zahari, will offer a few words on how to increase financial inclusion. And then we'll have two discussants from the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion, Haitham Gulaiga. Apologies for my mispronunciation, Mr. Gulaiga, and David Lewis from the FATF. And after that, we will open it up to you, to the audience for further comments. And asking you whether, if you want to make a comment, please do so using the chat function. And the moderator will then make sure that those chats come to us. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to the chair of the C20. We're very privileged to have her here today. Princess Noof Mohammed, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emil. And this panel today, I'll have my KKF hat on, and I'll get started. So friends and colleagues, it does give me great pleasure and honor to welcome you today to the C20 Summit and to this very, very distinguished panel. At the King Khalid Foundation, we have certainly not taken the problem associated with financial exclusion lightly. It's very dear to our hearts. In our 2018 report on financial inclusion in Saudi Arabia, an advocacy document seeking to draw attention to injustices adversely affecting the financially excluded. And there's a glaring paradox that some might find amusing. When those who take it upon themselves to champion the cause of the excluded are themselves excluded, there is a very good reason to feel a bit bemused. Of course, in more recent times, AML and CTF concerns have perhaps highlighted the reality that not all CSOs function for the betterment of humanity. And this is a salient fact we must recognize. But that governments and the global financial system are incapable of distinguishing the good from the not so good is a fact we are less inclined to accept. We've been advocating for years with our national government and central bank to ease restrictions on NPOs and to acknowledge the reality of financial exclusion that is hindering the work of NGOs in our country. And an important part of our work has been to advocate for the rights of the unbanked segments of civil society, totally in accordance with the SDGs. In 2018, we issued the very first financial inclusion policy paper in the Kingdom, noting the severe banking restrictions in our national banking system for NGOs. We also were proactive in proposing solutions and policy recommendations to reverse this policy and malpractice among commercial banks. All this has been within the broader context of a vision to promote access to financial services for other segments, including women, stateless persons, and those who find themselves defaulting on debt. And why should we do this? It's for no simpler reason, perhaps, than that by promoting continual and comprehensive economic growth for all, by providing financial products and services to all segments of society, especially the less fortunate, we empower such groups to make their contribution to economic growth. I'm not aware of any financial institution that would consider economic growth to be a bad thing, or that allowing a greater number of citizens to contribute to such growth might not be a good thing. We do no more than appeal to reason, common sense, and the global veneration of the almighty GDP. Our appeal goes out to both government bodies, who draconian regulatory restrictions fail to discern in the way I have already indicated, and I'm sorry to say that, but it is so, and also the banking sector's simplistic catch-all de-risking and inconsistent and incoherent implementation and interpretation of government policy as it relates to everyday transactions. And I'm sure our panel today will shed light on the negative consequences of such policies and practices. The negative impacts are real and are hindering the ability of NGOs and humanitarian workers to serve local communities and to fulfill their role as development partners working towards the realization of SDGs. And when we started engaging with the C20 several years ago, we realized that this unfortunate state of affairs is sadly shared by NGOs everywhere around the world, and maybe we felt less lonely. The great work for advocacy that we saw at the global level, pioneered by the Global NPO Coalition and FATF and our partners on this panel from Human Security Collective and Islamic Relief Worldwide, has been hindered and held back by the way ALM and CLT concerns have been too crudely applied to NPOs. We also quickly realized that this challenge could not be tackled effectively by national policy reform and dialogue between NGOs, central bankers, and commercial bankers alone. We need to discuss the problem as a global policy priority at the G20 and with the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion, the World Bank, and other global stakeholders. And so since we are the host of the C20 this year, we have made it a priority to continue pushing this agenda. And here lies absolutely a key barrier to civil society everywhere. So we must indeed make progress. And it would be remiss of me not to note the compounded impact COVID-19 has brought to this challenge. And let me just report a couple of key points that came out of a survey we ran in May this year of NGOs worldwide and the challenges and opportunities they have experienced during the pandemic. The findings of the survey were published recently in the document Knowledge Brief on the Impact of COVID-19 on Civil Society Organizations. And to summarize, we found on top of the increased demands for CSO services, we also noticed a considerable decline in charitable giving and finances, as well as difficulties for NGOs in adjusting to remote working. They found their financial transactions significantly disrupted. And locally, when the COVID-19 national lockdown took effect, NGOs were unable to access or manage their finances with banks when their doors closed. Of course, because of the banking rules against NGOs could not access their transactions and accounts online. But finally, I'd like to report some positives here in Saudi Arabia resulting from our research and actions at the King Khalid Foundation, which might suggest that it is not all doom and gloom. And I'm glad to say that we did manage to flag the problem to the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia and that this resulted in the central bank swiftly issuing a regulation and circular to the kingdom's commercial banks to give full NGO access to online, phone, and remote banking services. I should also say that after years of local advocacy, we are now able to see a better evaluation of AML-CTF risking arising from NGOs. And this is reflected in the National Strategy on AML-CTF and the local authorities' latest assessment of our sector, which reflects the similarly positive mutual evaluation report from the FATF. Our advocacy for a fair and viable financial environment for NGOs to operate in is a long-term priority for us at KKF, and we will continue to advocate for more financial inclusion of NGOs in Saudi Arabia and everywhere around the world, COVID-19 or not. I do look forward to the discussion today with such an authoritative and expert group of panelists, and I appreciate your time and your time taking to reflect on discuss this important issue with us today. And I do look forward to our collectively advancing the financial inclusion of NGOs around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Highness, for those insightful words and stating so eloquently indeed the paradox that is at the heart of this, that those focusing on the excluded are themselves excluded. That is indeed a deep irony, and thank you also for bringing to the fore the perspective of COVID-19 and indeed the increase that's in de-risking that so many have experienced. Without further ado, let me hand over to Leah von Broekhoven, the chair of the Human Security Collective. It is a great pleasure. And by the way, just as a housekeeping measure, I will not read everyone's full biography here. You can find that on the website. Everyone is very, very accomplished and has a very long list of palmares, so that would take away from our time. So please, with that, let me hand over to Leah.
Thank you very much, Emil, and thanks to you and to Princess Noof for your very clear and very helpful introductions. I'm also thankful to the King Khaled Foundation Islamic Relief Worldwide for organizing this panel together with us, and for all the speakers and the two discussants, Haitham and David. I'm only pronouncing your first names to be on this panel with us today. So let me quickly set the scene for the speakers that will come after me. Why the focus on NPOs and financial inclusion? And why do we engage with the G20 finance track through the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion? Emile and Princess Nouf made a strong case for solving financial access restrictions of NPOs because these restrictions, as they were saying, are real and are experienced daily by numerous NPOs across the world, whether they are working within their own countries or across the borders. However, awareness and attention for financial exclusion of NPOs compared to attention for de-risking and remittances or correspondent banking remains relatively low amongst G20 and GPIF members. Members of the Global NPO Coalition on the FATF and research institutions have in the past 5 years convincingly demonstrated through quantitative and qualitative studies that de-risking of NPOs by financial institutions is not a marginal topic. It is affecting our daily operations and therefore our beneficiaries in humanitarian crisis, in dire social economic circumstances, in situations where human rights violations against human rights defenders and environmentalists occur, and where authorities do not allow for the freedom of association or assembly for citizens that demand financial integrity and accountability from these authorities and private companies. Because NPOs are having more and more difficulties to access banking services, especially when it concerns transfers to higher risk areas, in areas that are not any longer reached because of decline in correspondent banking, vulnerable and poor women, youth, families, forcibly displaced people, target groups the GPFI cares about, are being financially excluded too. Financial access and economic empowerment for the poor cannot be achieved without the ability of the poor to organize themselves through community organizations and without the support by NPOs for leveraging this organizational capacity for social empowerment. Economic and social empowerment for the poor and vulnerable populations go hand in hand with an enabled operating space for NPOs, which includes access to financial services. The arguments for a sustained attention of financial inclusions of NPOs to the G20, the finance track at the G20 and the GPFI are threefold. There is an economic argument to be made. NPOs account for almost $2.2 trillion in operating expenditures, making NPOs, if they were a country, the 5th economy in the world in terms of GDP. There is a moral argument to be made. Civil society and humanitarian relief, and now achieving the sustainable development goals, amongst others, is widely recognized. This very C20 process, civil society engagement with the UN writ large, from the Human Rights Council to the SDG agenda, to the global counterterrorism strategy of the UN, the sustained engagement with the World Bank on international development, and the engagement of the global NPO coalition with the FATF demonstrates the vital role of civil society. Then there's an effectiveness argument to be made. Measures to protect NPOs for terrorism financing abuse have to be proportionate to the risk of this abuse. The FATF has strongly urged governments to conduct a risk assessment of NPOs as part of national risk assessment or as a sectoral risk assessment. They have written guidance on terrorism financing risk for NPOs with input from the Global NPO Coalition. And as Emile already mentioned, recently the World Bank has developed a terrorism finance for NPOs chapter in their national risk assessment methodology with support from the coalition. However, in the past decade or so, regulating and applying customer due diligence on NPOs with insufficient knowledge which NPOs are at risk have led to wholesale de-risking of civil society by financial institutions worldwide. Instead of applying a simplified customer due diligence when the risk is low, we have seen that some banks and correspondent banks continue to apply extended due diligence on good faith NPOs. Some NPOs have found workarounds, including using less transparent means or constructions for transferring funds, and thereby, although they find this highly problematic, undermining their financial integrity by greater instead of lesser risk-taking. Other NPOs, however, have been forced to enter programs which are often a lifeline for local civil society and vulnerable populations, and an alternative to the support these communities receive from terrorist groups. Financial integrity policy thus became counterproductive instead of effective for protecting NPOs from terrorism financing abuse, as it led to the exclusion of NPOs from the banking sector. Overall, the sector itself understands that it needs to show integrity and accountability to those they serve, our beneficiaries, and to our donors and supporters. Humanitarian organizations active in high-risk and volatile crisis situations have developed terrorism financing risk and sanctions compliance management guidance. Such guidance has also been developed under the leadership of members of the Global NPO Coalition in collaboration with ACAMS and the World Bank, and the Swiss government with ACAMS and the EU ECHO through a series of stakeholder roundtables. However, guidance, important as it is not enough. Existing guidance may not necessarily support NPOs that are working on human or environmental rights or on peace building and conflict transformation, topics that may be more difficult to understand and require more or too costly due diligence by financial institutions or are simply not liked by certain governments. The guidance may not support NPOs that have a faith-based or diaspora background or are smaller in size and often working on the front lines. As Princess Noof already said, there is, however, good news. Across the world, several initiatives have been developed that address these challenges to overcome financial exclusion of NPOs. Stakeholder dialogues to raise awareness and understanding amongst and across the sectors where bank supervisors, regulators, donor governments, financial intelligence units, banks, banking associations, NPOs participate have been established in the Netherlands, the UK, the US, and Europe. The conveners may differ. For example, in the US, the World Bank was the convener of such dialogue. In the UK, it's the Ministry of Home Affairs. In my own country, the Netherlands, it's the Ministry of Finance together with my organization, Human Security Collective. But the issues we address are similar. The importance of a risk-based approach to identify terrorism financing risk and measures to mitigate those risks, especially the risks that remain after all stakeholders have applied their risk management. A vexed problem, however, remains downstreaming of risks. Because terrorism financing risks and sanctions are still being considered by governments, donor governments, to be a problem for nonprofits and financial institutions to solve, we see in practice that the risk is being offloaded to the next one in the chain of compliance, ending with NPOs working on the front lines. Khalil Desai from Islamic Relief Worldwide and Ibrahim Modi from the United Peace Organization in Sudan will share their practices on addressing downstreaming of risks. An aligned financial integrity and financial inclusion approach is possible, and how this can be implemented in practice will be presented by Mariam Sahari from the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. She will also highlight the important role of financial institution supervisors here. Ruben Sandvliet of the ABN AMRO Bank in the Netherlands presents an approach that would help change internal bank practices when it comes to understanding the nature of nonprofit organizations and why bankers at various departments should work in tandem to avoid de-risking of civil society customers that are key for the bank's human rights and business commitments. Are technological solutions helping to bridge integrity and inclusion? At the last World Economic Forum, the statement was made that financial inclusion is at a turning point. The statement reads, due to advances in technology, the unprecedented advent of transactional and behavioral big data, and greater multi-stakeholder collaboration, there is a realistic opportunity to reach the 2 billion financially excluded and the many more that are underserved. Can NPOs be optimistic with the technological breakthrough that was announced here and is also supported by the GPFI agenda? Or is caution required, especially in relation to the business models and interests that underlie transactional and big data? Marta Lakritz-Peltier from TechSoup will share her work on enhancing risk sharing between donor governments and NPOs through a technological approach. To end my presentation, in these COVID-19 times, amid an eye to the public health, social, economic, and financial effects of the pandemic on the poor and vulnerable and marginalized, and those brave human rights defenders that stand up for them, and the civil society organizations that support them, we can say that this crisis has acted not as an equalizer, but a magnifier of existing and expectedly more obstacles to come for financial inclusion of NPOs and their beneficiaries. Therefore, I very much appreciate feedback at the end of this line of speakers by Haitham Al-Gulaiga from the GPFI and David Lewis from the Financial Action Task Force. For Haitham, I would like to pose this question. What can the GPFI and the G20 do to ensure that in advancing the global goal of financial inclusion, the current response mechanisms on de-risking and the financial inclusion of NPOs are aligned? To David, this question. Your team has been very supportive in earlier C and G20 events of our global NPO coalition's advocacy for a risk-based and proportionate approach to customer due diligence by banks. What can other international standard setters, apart from the FATF, do, such as the Financial Stability Board, to help solve the financial integrity and financial inclusion conundrum? And how can we, stakeholders present today, work together on this? Thank you very much. Looking forward to the next speakers, and back to you, Emil.
Thank you so much, Leah, for laying the ground so articulately and with such a comprehensive overview, both of the problems and indeed the fact that not only are we undermining transparency, but some organizations have actually had to stop their operations, but also for pointing the way forward. I think that was an excellent scene setting. So without further ado, let me hand over to Khalil Desai from Islamic Relief Worldwide for his comments. Thank you very much. Khalil, you have the floor.
Emil, panelists, thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be part of this panel and to be able to talk about this really fundamental issue on behalf of Islamic Relief Worldwide. I'm also really pleased that as far as humanitarian actors, I'm able to represent our experience as a large British-based humanitarian actor with over a footprint in over 40 countries, but critically, and I think this is representative of what the C20 are really trying to do this year, is also include voices and a very real lived experience of those actually doing a lot of the work. So I'm really pleased to say that we will be also hearing from Ibrahim, as Emil foreshadowed at the start. Let me start by saying our remit on this panel is to recognize, or is to maybe portray, to put a mirror up to what is the actual experience, what is the actual result of the financial exclusion. So we've heard some really powerful words. I think Princess Noof at the outset and Leah have really articulated why this is such an important issue for this C20 and for the wider humanitarian space and those who want to further that space, why it's so critical. The most often, I think, first of all, let me say it is really positive that there is a recognition and there's awareness of just how problematic the limitation on financial access as far as humanitarian activity is. That it really is important that we're not having to rehash and persuade people that this is a problem. However, I think there is still, from our perspective, and I know Ibrahim will speak about this as well, I think the pace of change and the pace of seeing how this translates into concrete action is proving much slower. So there is a recognition, and that is absolutely right, and it reflects all the work that has been done. You know, Leah rightly highlighted that there's a recognition at FATF level. You know, it's really important that David Lewis is going to address you as part of this panel. There's also lots of work being done, stakeholder engagements and forums at government level. However, the issue is really critical, and we've seen that particularly as a result of the recent COVID pandemic that we've all been living through. What this has done is crystallized the systemic issues of the lack of financial access, the ability to move money to where it's needed for humanitarian action, and how challenging and problematic that is, and actually inhibiting life-saving work. And I don't apologize for putting it in those terms, because that is certainly our experience. So let's just reflect a little bit on the last 6 months as we've experienced as Islamic Relief, but as you know, it could be any other organization that's looking to support the response to COVID. So globally, what do we know? We know that we've all experienced states of emergency, closing of schools, you know, the restrictions on travel, and the closing of non-essential businesses. In many countries, particularly in the global north and in others where the economy and the financial situation permits, we've been able to deploy a testing, tracing, and isolation sort of model to try and open up some of our economies. But the situation in many developing countries and in countries where the economy isn't able to put in place the testing and the capacities and the gravity of the situation really needs to be properly presented and represented as part of this discussion, because there is a direct correlation between the inability to access financial resources and the ability to move those resources and the ability to help people. So in many countries, there isn't the ability for the governments to mobilize structures to test and trace. Many of the country operations that were, because of the economic lockdown, has undoubtedly resulted in the increase of poverty, hunger, and destitution. So there's a very clear social impact. And we know from lots of research and data that has disproportionately affected young women, and because they're overrepresented in informal economies, their lack of access to savings, and because they work in sectors that's impacted or by social distancing, there's really acute social issues affecting young women in particular. There's obviously the collapse of the global demand, and that means in terms of whether it's tourism, manufacturing, light manufacturing, and remittances, all of these things have completely collapsed globally over the last 6 months. And of course, not least, there's the huge health crisis, which is related to you know, kind of the illness and the consequences of COVID. And all of this in context where it's not possible to isolate, where it's not possible to test and trace. So this is exactly the situation in which you would expect an organization like Islamic Relief, but equally many other humanitarian actors, whether operating out of the global north or locally, to be able to step in, to be able to provide that essential support and aid that's needed, whether that's financial, whether that's in terms of equipment, whether that's in terms of medicines. What we've seen, and I'll speak from the perspective of what is essentially a large, you know, £130 million plus organization with a degree of expertise and resources to try and manage this regulatory framework and the complexities of getting aid and money where it's needed quickly. But what we've seen is the delay, the diversion, the bureaucracy that's overlaid on the understanding of counterterrorism financing and anti-money laundering has significantly hampered our ability to respond and react to this emerging crisis, which as we've seen is particularly acute in those places where there's a real concentration of people such as refugee camps. So what does this look like in practice? What does this look like as far as my teams and individuals here in the UK trying to move the donations that we've very generously received from our supporters, from our donors who want to support these causes? Islamic Relief is fortunate in that we have both access to institutional funding, but also a very large and supportive community-based fundraising, a donor base that want to support. What our experience has been is the extensive due diligence, the real sense that banks consider non-profits as high risk for financial crime and essentially low profit for them, and the refusal to take on relationships with NPOs has really been reflected across the sector in stakeholder forums, in conversations that we've been involved in platforms that Leah and I have often participated on. What's also clear, and I think worth repeating, is most concerning and something we all need to be acutely sensitive to in our current climate and context, is that there's also a very disproportionate impact on certain parts of the sector. So what we also know is smaller, localized NPOs are being isolated and hit the hardest. So their ability to access funds, whether it's fulfilling projects on behalf of Islamic Relief or other institutional donors, or even directly using their own funding, is proving harder and harder, and to some extent almost impossible. You heard Leah mention that people are seeking alternative ways to program because the traditional established financial routes just aren't available to them. I think the other important element to raise is the impact on particularly Muslim faith-based charities. There's the research again identifies that just how many additional barriers are being placed on those NPOs. And so this has a very direct impact on our ability to fulfill the SDGs and our localization absolute priority. It's never always, it doesn't always necessarily come across in statistics, but just on the part of Islamic Relief, let me just offer you these sort of figures just to indicate just how much work and time and energy goes in to the movement of funds from our UK headquarters to globally in the places where we are programming. So up to July 2020, we've done £42 million worth of international transactions. So 18 million of those, that's 43%, have been what's called compliance queried. That means that there's been some sort of challenge or question or request for further information made on those 43% of those transactions. Now, in the majority of those cases, they are resolved and the money ultimately is able to get to its destination. But essentially, we are dealing with questions from the beneficiary bank, from the correspondent banks, and from the remitting bank. And often, in a number of these cases, there's an overlaying of a risk appetite, which is extremely low by these banks, in order for us to be able to move this money. So there is, in short, there is a huge amount of work that organizations are having to do to simply fulfill their humanitarian objectives and missions. I want to make sure that Ibrahim has sufficient time to also reflect on what his experience is as somebody responsible for a smaller localized organization that is subject to exactly what Leah highlighted, which is the downstreaming of risk and the overlaying of responsibility and compliance measures that are being demanded by banks in this, in order to meet what is sometimes a misguided assessment of what the risk is that NPOs provide, or the risk NPOs are to them. Let me hand over to Ibrahim, and he will provide his analysis of what this issue, what impact this has had for organizations like his on the ground.
Thank you very much, Khalil. Indeed, Ibrahim Modi from United Peace Organization, you have the floor.
Hello, thank you so much, Khalil, and it's really my pleasure actually to be part of this panel. And it's also a really good opportunity to reflect our experience on financial inclusion and exclusion, especially in the country that being actually categorized as a terrorist country, and also it has a lot of economic sanctions being put in place for almost 30 years. So my name is Ibrahim Modi, and I am representing a local NGO called UPO, stand for United Peace Organization. We are established in 2009 in the wake of the conflict in the western part of the country and also South Sudan. Mainly, we are providing shelter, food aid, water, education, and protection services to almost 200,000 children and women that are extremely affected by conflict on an annual basis. Since the inception of our organization, we were able to assist almost 2.2 million people in IDPs, refugees, and in underserved areas. So our services actually...
Ibrahim, apologies for interrupting. Could you get a bit closer to the microphone, because it's quite hard to hear you. Thank you.
I hope now is okay. Everyone is hearing me.
It's a bit better. Yeah, there's some interference, but we can hear you better. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So since we established, we actually changed thousands of, we changed the life of thousands of people. We were able to restore hope to many children and empower many thousands of women to build their resilience in the face of external risk and shock they face as a result of conflict and disasters that's happening every year in Sudan. As I speak now, I also raise the voice and the concerns of financial inclusions of other local NGOs as well. I'll be speaking as well on behalf of the NGOs Forum that's composed over 600 local non-profit organizations that working actually to provide assistance in the camps and also in the conflict affected areas. Sudan actually has been a very particular country, especially since the inception, since the independence of the country. Always there has been an issue with the banking, and the banking service actually being categorized weak, and the financial inclusion is also weak since actually 1960s, like after the independence of the country immediately. And this actually, the situation has been exacerbated by the ongoing economic sanctions that imposed in the country since 1997, and when all the banks were cut off effectively from the global financial system, that led to loss of trust between investors, financial institutions, and donor countries, and left the banks without access to financial and interbanking market. These exclusions have badly damaged the Sudanese economy. Even so, there are over 34 commercial banks in Sudan, but only 2 banks are allowed to receive foreign currency. These banks internally face number of challenges. This include a very restrictive role that imposed by the Central Bank of Sudan, and also facing a cash liquidity issues and the trans between the bank and customer. And that actually mean that over 80% of the cash block is outside the bank. This led to a poor service coverage and only a small number of population that have access to the bank. Having said so, as I speak now, over 80% of the population in these countries are unbanked. They actually have no financial access, as the financial exclusion is also a huge barrier for disadvantaged populations. Financial inclusion is also linked to the economic and social development. And as of today, we have over 40% of the populations in the 2 countries are in dire need for humanitarian assistance that driven by the ongoing conflict, pandemics, COVID pandemics, and also the flood. So non-profit organizations like UPO actually have taken a very effective role, and they're in front line to respond to these emerging needs to save lives of children, women, elders, and people with disability. As you know, local NGOs, local non-profit organizations are unlike international organizations who have already well-established connections with financial institutions internationally when it comes to a fund transfer to the country inside. And this is especially if the NGO is from the West country, it has more backup than actually the NGOs coming from Africa, and it's working in my country. The global exclusion of these countries have actually created additional operational burden to the local NGOs like UPL. Fund transfer to local non-profit organization always has been an issue, and it's very difficult, or sometimes is impossible, frustrating, and leaving the people it serves in a great risk to lose life, chance of education, and hope. The major challenge that non-profit face, especially in the context of Sudan, include a complete denial of fund transfer from outside due to the sanctions and restriction, especially if the funds is coming from Europe, America, Middle East, and Australia. Other challenge also include the high fee of the transfer. This is actually, it's happened, and it's not always happening. And sometimes a closure of accounts in the name of terror. Significant delay in the transfer, increase unnecessarily scrutiny and lengthy due diligence process with bank and funding agency. And this actually has significantly affected the non-profit NGOs and increase additional burden on their operation that in sensitive environment. And all of this is actually has a large impact. And if you allow me to give you example, that we have...
Ibrahim, sorry to intervene, we only have 40 more minutes for the entire panel. So if I could ask you to round off pretty quickly, I apologize for having to do this. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So if we can share example, we have number of NGOs recently affected, especially when the COVID pandemic is ongoing, and number of people actually receiving assistance. And we have one of the NGOs that actually cannot receive its fund due to these restrictions, and it's leaving over 7,000 beneficiaries that really not receiving their assistance. We have a grant transfer issues that actually affected projects that responding to GBV and also women needs, especially in the COVID. Sometimes the local profits NGOs have to find a medial company to transfer the fund to the country especially sometimes it takes more than 6 months. And notably this year, we have more than 6 NGOs, a part of our larger forum, that can't receive their payment since January because of the transfer challenge and restrictions. I have an example where I was a visitor in one of the camps the last 2 months, and the camps actually having over 200,000 populations. And one of the NGOs is running water services to these populations, and it cannot actually run the service due to the delay, significant delay of receiving the fund from outside. We have a number of examples actually.
Ibrahim, could we hold the examples? I think you've given very illustrative ideas so far. We really we only have 39 minutes. We really have to move on. Could you just say a final concluding remarks? Thank you.
Actually, in my conclusions, the risking represent actually a market failure, and I think all the investors, stakeholders, including the bank, appear to be actually rational in their own interest. And I think this AML CFT increases scrutiny, continue to produce failure state, increase poverty, and undermine the anti-money laundering objective. So it further isolates the vulnerable communities from the international financial institution, and also it creates political tensions and another parallel underground market. In my conclusions, I see these anti-money laundering measures do not entirely limit financial access. Internationally standard urge financial institutions only to adopt risk-based approach, but not misapplication for the risk-based approach. So this should be actually a strong risk-based approach should be applied by the banking institutions rather than ending up the relationship altogether. So in the case of UPO, and especially in Sudan, we ask that if it's possible, especially the financial institution internationally, could give a special waiver to the local NGOs that are providing the fund, especially in Sudan, where the needs are high, especially the humanitarian.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Well heard on the problems faced in Sudan. Thank you for your words. Without further ado, let me hand over to Ruben Zandvliet from the ABN AMRO Bank. Ruben, you have the.
Thanks, Emil, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this panel. So let me start off by saying that I do not regularly work with NPOs, not in a commercial role or not as a compliance or AML or terrorism financing expert. So my role within ABN AMRO Bank is to make sure that we act in accordance with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which is perhaps a bit of a different perspective in this discussion. So what are the UN guiding principles on business and human rights? It's a set of non-binding standards that were adopted in 2011 by the UN Human Rights Council, and it provides a normative framework to make sure what companies should do to respect human rights. Some of you may be familiar with them, some of you won't. The OECD guidelines for multinational organizations is a similar framework, and although it covers more topics than just human rights, the human rights chapter in it is also basically copy-pasted from the UN guiding principles. It states that, of course, states, countries are obliged to protect human rights based on international laws and conventions, but companies have an obligation to or duty to respect. And that means that they should check how they might cause, contribute, or be directly linked to adverse impacts on human rights in their supply chains, but also in their own business operations. And ABN AMRO was in 2016 the first to publish a a report addressing our most salient human rights risks. And in 2018, we revisited that report. And for the first time, we also recognized that access to financial services for NPOs might also be a human rights issue that we should look at from this perspective of the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights. We weren't exactly sure how to understand the issue from a human rights perspective and what to do in a practical sense. But luckily, we found some great support from New York University Law School in Paris, which through its European Public Interest Law Clinic worked with us, with a number of students, to flesh out these issues. And we drafted the report also in cooperation with Dentons Netherlands, Dutch branch of a global law firm, and Human Security Collective. And the paper, which will come out in due course, is entitled Bank De-risking of NPOs, a Business and Human Rights Perspective. So in a sense, this small talk is a bit of a teaser for the final report, which will be available soon. And the purpose of the report is really to for compliance functions within banks to become acquainted with the UN Guiding Principles, and vice versa for general sustainability or human rights experts to become familiar with the issue of de-risking of NPOs, and to see this as a human rights issue that should also be addressed in their human rights due diligence. So the paper firstly elaborates on what are the human rights issues in the sphere of de-risking. So it discusses freedom of association, discrimination, but also all the indirect impacts on beneficiaries that previous speakers have already elaborated on. And it recognizes that if de-risking of NPOs is in itself, or it has a negative impact on human rights, then banks should look at this from a human rights perspective. And that means that they should address this issue in their human rights commitments, and that they should do active due diligence on it, which means that they should identify if de-risking occurs, and what is necessary, what actions are necessary to prevent that. And also very important to communicate with their stakeholders about this. And not only, of course, communicate in a one-way direction, but to learn from each other, to engage in a mutual conversation. And lastly, to provide for a remedy when de-risking has occurred. And the remedy gap is something that we've identified in particular in the report. Although, and I'll try to be brief as well in sake of time, although banks are increasingly looking at their responsibility to respect human rights in accordance with the UN Guiding Principles, the debate so far has very much been about lending activities. So it is about the high-risk sectors that banks lend money to. It's about our palm oil clients, it's about oil and gas clients, it's about textiles manufacturing clients. But the UN Guiding Principles also apply to our own business operations and banks' own decisions that may cause de-risking. We will continue to work on this within ABN AMRO, but I would also stress here that there's legislation coming from the European Commission that will sort of harness the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights into hard law. So this obligation to identify human rights risks through a process of due diligence will likely in a few years be mandatory for all banks in Europe. Well, our approach is to, if you see legislation coming, be prepared across the wide range of human rights issues that banks are connected to. And de-risking of NGOs is certainly one of them. So thank you. I'll leave it here, and happy to engage further, of course, in a Q&A with you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ruben. And that is certainly a very new perspective that in these conversations that you know, AML buffs and others have had for a long time is a new perspective, business and human rights, and how that might play into this. And very encouraging to hear that this will be made hard law in EU legislation, as you said at the end. Thanks very much. Talking further about solutions, Marta Lakritz from TechSoup, you have the floor to talk about the technological solutions in this regard. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It is truly an honor to be here among such an impressive group. I am a general counsel at TechSoup. We are a global NGO based in San Francisco, and I manage a program called NGO Source that I'll mention momentarily because of its relevance to this discussion. A big part of my current job involves thinking through compliance-based solutions to barriers in civil society that can be overcome or mitigated through the use of digital platforms. So just a bit about my organization. TechSoup's mission is to resource NGOs around the world with digital tools and platforms that enable them to better achieve their missions, whether that be donating software to them, developing social good apps, leading courses, or, and this is where I'll focus today, streamlining and localizing due diligence processes for NGOs and also donors. My role specifically is focused on designing the content that is then deployed over digital platforms. So to be clear, while I've been tasked to speak about technical solutions, I am not myself a technologist by any means, though I am, like many of us, an advocate of, an ardent user of technology. The other caveat I'll provide is that my work does not involve blockchain. These days, when you hear technology and finance, the next hot word is inevitably blockchain, and there's undoubtedly a lot of potential there, but it's not something I am personally engaged in. My stake in this discussion, again, has to do with the way we, and more specifically, governments, donors, and banks collect, protect, and utilize nonprofit data. And when I say data, I'm focusing on compliance data, broadly speaking. So not only KYC, know your client customer information, but also all of the other information that becomes part of an organization's risk management profile, its reputation, and its ability to communicate externally its capacity and its potential. So let me step back a moment and review how this collection and vetting of this kind of data is not currently working in favor of NGOs. And this was already highlighted quite effectively by Khalil, who mentioned all of the resources Islamic Relief, for example, expends just toward compliance exercises for the purpose of moving funds. So currently, as has been said, not only is it increasingly difficult to transfer funds to nonprofits in high-risk countries, but it's undertaken on a case-by-case basis. There's no standard and there's no uniform place where the information is stored. So the same is true for large funders, governments, and foundations. Not only is there often a reluctance to transfer funds because of perceived or actual risk to locations and organizations that have been deemed high risk, but these determinations are, again, consistently undertaken on a case-by-case basis. So let's say you're a humanitarian NGO in Pakistan, you're seeking funds from the development arm of a foreign government and also a grant from a US foundation. You're also trying to ensure that funds are able to be safely transferred into your local bank account through a correspondent bank. So not only are you trying to serve your vital mission on the ground, but you're also gathering documentation and completing disparate due diligence processes on behalf of disparate parties, none of whom are communicating with each other or sharing the data collected. So what you end up with is hours of resources being duplicated many times over, all to serve the same purpose, which is to prove that your organization is able to safely manage and distribute funds. Our argument at TechSoup is that there is no reason this cannot all be achieved one time in one place where the information is controlled by the NGO, who is able to update, add to, and build up a profile that is accessible to multiple parties. It's a very simple idea, really. You create a repository where the information is collected, protected, and amplified at the sole direction of the NGO or at the request of a donor or a bank. So this is the kind of work that TechSoup has been invested in for a little over a decade. And we've had a great amount of success in the US with creating a repository of international NGOs who have been vetted for US tax law purposes and whose information is then collected and shared with private foundations. This program is called NGO Source. It was launched in 2013, and it has vastly streamlined and localized compliance for US foundations. And more importantly, it puts hours of resources back into the hands of NGOs who would otherwise be providing largely the same information to multiple funders over and over again. What we're working on now, following in the success of NGO Source, which is a strong self-sustaining program, is taking that model and replicating it on a much larger scale. So we take the repository notion and we give NGOs the ability to pull all of this data into a single location. And we go a step further by providing access to local tools and resources in local languages where NGOs can learn how to strengthen their risk management practices. So there's a real benefit to the vetted and also the vetter. It gives donors and banks access to a wealth of vetted data, historic and current, on which they can rely to more realistically address risk. So, this kind of repository is in the works. It takes time, it takes advocacy, it has to be politically agnostic, and it has to be open to all NGOs, regardless of size or sophistication level. But, admittedly, due diligence is not a sexy topic, but it is something we know can be done better. And we've seen improved in the case of NGO Source. We're working on that now in the context of humanitarian NGOs. And we do truly believe that this can change the landscape of inclusion. And so for the sake of time, I will leave it there and pass it to the next panelist.
Thank you very much, Martha, for that fascinating insight into, I'd heard of NGO Source, but it's very encouraging to hear that it will be rolled out wider internationally, and very much anxious to hear what is happening on that front. Now turning it over to Mariam Zahari of the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. Mariam, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Emil, and warm greetings to all. I'd like to thank the co-organizers, Human Security Collective, the Summit Relief Worldwide, and King Khalid Foundation for having us. It is indeed a great pleasure for AFI to be a part of this very timely panel, particularly because we are a network of national financial policymakers and regulators, such as central banks and ministries of finance from more than 85 jurisdictions in the global south, who have made it their mandate to advance financial inclusion in tandem with the pursuit of financial integrity, financial stability, and consumer protection policy outcomes. And we have been grappling with the challenge of aligning financial inclusion and financial integrity policy outcomes for many years now. We have also come to recognize how NPOs have been on the end of unjustified de-risking, and how this is not ideal considering NPOs are vital for the empowerment of the most disadvantaged groups that we are committed to serving, such as women, youth, forcibly displaced persons, and MSMEs. So in response to the challenges in aligning the goals of financial inclusion and financial integrity at a practical level, we developed the Inclusive Financial Integrity Toolkit. And the toolkit's purpose is to provide practical guidance on aligning financial inclusion and AML-CFT policy outcomes with respect to the formulation and implementation of policy and regulation towards achieving what we term as inclusive financial integrity. And here, when we say inclusive financial integrity, we simply just refer to a state of success in achieving sound alignment and a sound alignment between financial inclusion and AML-CFT policy objectives, which is essentially attained when a country has established a safe financial system that has effective measures in place to identify, assess, understand, and mitigate MLTF risks, and then to act as soon as those risks have been detected. But at the same time, it is just as equally able to provide greater access to and usage of quality formal financial services in a way that enhances the livelihoods of the most disadvantaged segments and that drives sustainable development that truly leaves no one behind. And the toolkit's content predominantly draws on our members' practical experiences and has also benefited from the inputs of the FATF-style regional bodies, the FATF Secretariat, and the humanitarian and private sectors. So by doing so, it complements the global AML-CFT standards and supports their implementation by addressing the very specific challenges that our members have found as central banks and ministries of finance to prevent success in aligning financial inclusion and AML-CFT within the most important processes of an inclusive financial integrity policy cycle. So I'd like to highlight 3 solutions that we provide in the toolkit, which can address NPO de-risking or the financial exclusion of NPOs. First, ensure that at the country level, both financial inclusion and AML-CFT stakeholders can collectively define a shared vision of success in achieving inclusive financial integrity, including for NPOs. Without such a shared vision or common goal having been endorsed by all the relevant stakeholders, it is impossible to coordinate any policy action and achieve any meaningful impact that can be clearly measured. Because I think, as we know, in practice, there is often very limited engagement between financial inclusion stakeholders and AML-CFT stakeholders, and therefore limited alignment and synchronization between their respective activities. And at this step, it would be crucial to do two things. One, sensitize all stakeholders to the importance of financially including NPOs within the context of the country's wider national financial inclusion agenda. And two, ensure the involvement of financial inclusion stakeholders, such as the central bank's financial inclusion unit in MLTF risk assessment processes. For example, in Zimbabwe, the country established a supervisors forum to better coordinate various supervisors around inclusive financial integrity, national risk assessments, and mutual evaluations. So as opposed to doing this on a one-off basis during specific MEs and NRAs, the forum provides a mechanism to focus on these issues on an ongoing basis and to reduce inefficiencies in information sharing. In Nigeria, MOUs have been signed between principal financial inclusion and AML-CFT stakeholder institutions, and then operationalized by assigning responsible directors and point people for regular liaisons. So thereafter, all interactions have been normalized. This, of course, has enhanced coordination between the two sectors. Second, build the capacities of financial policymakers and regulators, financial institutions, and also NPOs. It is important to build the capacity of financial policymakers and regulators, we found, and also the financial institutions that they regulate to properly identify, assess, understand, and mitigate MLTF risks in the NPO sector towards implementing a risk-based, proportionate approach to financially including NPOs. So this is so important because in reality, it is still challenging to transition from a rules-based approach that may result in unjustified de-risking. At the same time, it is of course just as critical to improve NPO knowledge on the country's AML-CFT requirements so that they can be effectively complied to. Finally, leverage technological solutions such as RegTag and digital identities to facilitate the implementation of the RBA. It would be very helpful for financial policymakers and regulators to begin understanding, befriending, and using emerging technological solutions for meeting MLCFT requirements, as they can offer solutions to specific de-risking drivers, such as low AML-CFT capability, capacity to assess and manage risks without exiting relations, and cost of compliance. For example, in Mexico, the CNBV started the development of a subtech platform that will allow the receipt, storage, validation, and automated processing of information. And the platform consists of information exchange through APIs for fintechs, receipt and processing of large volumes of information for general reporting by all of the sectors being regulated, and the provision of analytical dashboards. In the Pacific region, what we've seen is the development of a Pacific KYC utility by the central banks of Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu, Fiji, Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea, in collaboration with the Reserve Banks of Australia and New Zealand. And it is intended to function as a repository of data for KYC and CDD, which will facilitate access to the information necessary for effectively and efficiently conducting those processes, and thereby increasing MLCFT capability and reducing compliance costs. In Egypt, eKYC has been implemented for the onboarding of new customers and for the verification of already banked customers during using electronic verification methods for bank products. And the Central Bank of Egypt collaborates very closely with the Egyptian AML-CFT unit to allow customers to subscribe to mobile money without going to branches or agents, which has increased financial inclusion in the country, even during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I know that we're really short on time, and that's why I've been talking very fast. So I'll stop here so that we can hear from Haitham and David. Thank you very much, and back to you, Emil.
Thank you very much, Mariam, and thank you for taking into account the time. That's very kind of you. And even though you might have been speaking fast, you were very comprehensible, and it was very easy to understand, and very interesting to hear what AFI is doing on this front. Okay, Mr. Haitham Al-Gulaiga, you have the floor on behalf of the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion and the co-chair of on behalf of Saudi Arabia. Haitham, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Emil, and I want to thank the C20 and the organizers for the opportunity to join you today. I will speak, I'm weary of time, so I'll try to speak a little bit faster, so I apologize from the beginning. The focus of the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion, GPFI, is to improve access to financial services for those that are hardest to reach and to accelerate the financial inclusion for underserved and vulnerable groups. The GPFI was created in 2010 against the backdrop of the last financial crisis to advance financial inclusion not only among G20 countries, but around the world. The GPFI is an inclusive platform for all G20 countries, non-G20 countries, and working with implementing partners and affiliated partners, including many NGOs and international organizations, to assist achieving our mandate at the G20 level to promote economic growth, financial stability, and equality. The GPFI provides leadership for the global financial inclusion community through its representation in the G20 finance track via policy development and analysis, knowledge sharing, and promoting international cooperation. We are committed to advancing financial inclusion globally by increasing equality, access to, and the usage of sustainable formal financial services to expand the opportunities for the underserved and excluded households and enterprises. In 2020, under the Saudi presidency, we have reviewed the G20 Financial Inclusion Action Plan, which sets out the key priorities for the GPFI over the next few years, which are digital financial inclusion and SME finance. And this work will be carried out under the leadership of the newly appointed long-term GPFI co-chairs, following a streamlining exercise of the structure of the GPFI. The non-profit organizations around the world play a critical role in meeting humanitarian needs, international development, and providing development finance, which are key drivers for financial inclusion. NPOs can provide an important channel to facilitate financial inclusion of those communities and that are very hardest to reach through their provision of initiatives and financial services, which are vital for the development. NPOs can also provide key services that contribute to financial inclusion. Nonprofits can provide a link for individuals and communities to participate in their local economies, create an enabling environment, and improving the overall quality of people's lives. This issue is more important now than ever in the response to the COVID-19 crisis, especially where NPOs are providing on-the-ground support for vulnerable populations. The nonprofit community has played, the NPOs can be reliant on bank transfers to send funds and facilitate humanitarian support, and to receive funds from donors and grants. In order to ensure the NPOs are able to carry out their important mandate, which support essential development and humanitarian activity, they ought to have access to financial services they need to be able to operate effectively. Assessing the impact of de-risking is an issue that has previously been highlighted as part of the GPFI's work and to shed light on issues which prevent financial inclusion. In 2015, with GPFI partners from the World Bank, the GPFI previously focused on assessing the effects of banks' de-risking actions on access to financial services for international remittance services providers, money transfer operators, and corresponding banking relationships. As a result, the GPFI identified the need for policymakers and regulators to clarify regulatory expectations and to respond to inaccurate perceptions that may be resulting in excessively risk-averse behavior by banks. De-risking can be particularly damaging in emerging and developing countries where access to the international financial system is critical to participation in the economy and for making and receiving payments across borders. Digital technologies may enable a new entrance into the financial sector, as well as incumbent banks, to operate more effectively, leveraging technology to reduce the cost of compliance and to make better use of a wider range of data sources to meet compliance requirements and provide customers, including NPOs, with better service and products. Digital financial inclusion and innovation provide opportunities to expand the scope, scale, and reach of financial services. The GBFI supports measures to increase responsible access to usage of digital financial services worldwide, spurred by the growth of these new technologies. The GBFI is focused on engaging actively with public and private sector to support the development of regulatory frameworks, the infrastructure and financial ecosystem needed for the advancement of digital financial services. This includes the availability of alternative data to enhance credit reporting to enable access to digital financial services. Through developing private sector partnership with NPOs and building the relationships between financial services providers and NPOs, it may be possible to overcome barriers in financial inclusion of NPOs through building alternative data sources and collaboration with the private sector. Interpretation of AML and CTF regulation may have had some unintended consequences for financial exclusion of NPOs. The GBFI has worked closely with the regulatory and citizen bodies to encourage greater consideration of all aspects of financial inclusion in policy development, and to ensure that no one is left behind or excluded from accessing financial services. With enhanced cooperation arrangement adopted by the GBFI with the Bank of International Settlements, the GBFI will continue to be an effective platform for jointly addressing the financial inclusion issue. The GBFI will continue to assess the evolving financial landscape to evaluate how the use of the technology is changing the availability and accessibility to financial services, and to ensure that the opportunities for digitization can be fully realized. This includes working closely with regulators and policymakers. In the coming years, the GBFI will perform a regulatory diagnostic exercise to assess and mitigate unintended consequences of financial inclusion. The G20 high-level policy principles, the high-level principles for digital financial inclusion in 2016 highlighted the importance of enabling and proportionate legal and regulatory framework to support digital financial inclusion. There are challenges which need to be balanced with innovation to achieve digital financial inclusion and to identify, assess, and mitigate new risks, including AML and CFT risks. The principles also identify the need to facilitate and assess the digital financial services by developing or encouraging the development of customer identified systems. The nonprofit organizations are a key part of the distribution channel for the humanitarian support and facilitating financial inclusion, particularly in hard to reach communities. NPOs respond and represent an important segment of wider membership of GBFI. We work closely with NGOs and international organizations on specific action and policy development. Under the planned work agenda ahead for the GBFI, we will develop an implementation framework for high-level principles to assess how this guidance has been implemented and to identify gaps, new challenges, and risks of digital financial inclusion. The GBFI will continue to build private sector partnership, and we will work closely with the SSPs to ensure that all aspects of financial inclusion are considered in policy development. We will also conduct a regulatory diagnostic exercise to evaluate the lessons learned and overcome the regulations for financial inclusion, and to identify further mitigating actions that need to be taken. I will stop here and I will leave room for David.
Thank you very much, Haitham. That's very considerate and very clear presentation on what's happening on the financial inclusion. David, FATF have been mentioned many times already, so last word is yours. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emil. And in the interest of time, I won't read out the wonderful speech that my team did for me and all the things FATF have done. I can say that we agree with everything that's been said so far. There is a deep recognition of the issues facing the sector. So I think what I'll do is I'll touch on why this is important to the FATF, how we seek to address it, and then come back to Leah's question about what next and what others can do as well. And I'll try and do that in 2 or 3 minutes. So firstly, why is this important? Well, we stop money laundering in order to save lives. Money laundering fuels crime and terrorism. It's not just a financial and economic issue. We're there to protect people, the environment, and economies. So to that end, we're all in the same boat. We're serving and seeking the same mission. And financial inclusion is central to successful anti-money laundering. You can't stop money laundering without having financial inclusion. That said, we never will stop money laundering. While there is money laundering, while there's crime rather, there will be money laundering. And so what we try and do is put in place a system to prevent and detect it. And that's why financial institutions, lawyers and accountants are central to this. But we don't expect them to prevent transactions. You know, they are experts at managing risk, and we expect them to identify the risks, manage those risks, and where they identify suspicious activity, to report it to the authorities, so the authorities can take the action. We do not have a system where we expect banks to close down the space for civil society or anyone else. Everyone, I mean, it's a basic human right these days, access to the financial system. So that's why it's so important. This is a moral and ethical issue. It's not just an economic and financial or regulatory issue. So that's why it's so important to us. How do we address it? Well, as has been mentioned already, the risk-based approach is central to the FATF standards. And that means we require banks to assess their risks and put in place measures that are proportionate to those risks. And today, since the FATF was started, we have 205 jurisdictions that have committed to implementing those properly. They're not all doing a good job, I have to say. There's a long way to go, but they recognize, I think, what needs to be done. And there's a lot of sign, a lot of reason for hope here. We issue standards, guidance, best practice. We evaluate countries against these standards, and we publish those evaluations. And this is critical because this is one of the ways we can hold countries to account. We can shine a light on bad practice, and we can promote good practice. And Emil mentioned that at the beginning, how looking at whether civil society, NPOs are being closed down inappropriately, that's part of an assessor's job, and that's critical here. Reasons for hope, again, we are looking now at our strategic review. How can we improve the timeliness, the effectiveness, how can we make sure our evaluations are more risk-based? That will hold countries to account more often and more effectively. We're also looking at how we can utilize digitalization. So we've heard from TechSoup, great ideas there. The potential for technology to rapidly and substantially improve the effectiveness of banks' measures and to take a more risk-based approach so that they are not cutting off vital lifelines to vulnerable communities all over the world. That technology is here and it's available now. And so the FATF is looking at how we can work with technology companies, how we can encourage governments to adopt this technology. And we started already last year. We issued the first guidance anywhere on the use of digital ID for customary due diligence. So there's lots of good work there, lots of reasons for hope. Leah mentioned other international organizations. We work closely with the AFI, with CGAP, the IMF, the World Bank. Their risk assessment methodology is really important here, the UN and also the FSB. In terms of things we need to be doing next and what they can do, we need to not just continue this dialogue and continue to raise awareness of the issue, but I think we need to focus more on the use of technology and also take into account information from CSOs when we do our work. So for example, when we go and do an evaluation of a country, we should be taking information from you guys about the problems you're seeing in those countries. So the assessors have a better understanding of the questions they should be asking and where they should be prodding countries and holding them to account. So there is a mechanism to do that. The evaluations, the timetable for them are published on the FATF website. I would encourage everyone to send us information about countries. In terms of what else can be done next, de-risking is sadly not just an AML issue. It's often done in the name of AML. It's often a commercial issue. We've seen repeated failures by banks and fines for these failures. And that's when they're serving clients that are not just high risk, but high net worth clients. I suspect if your business was worth a bit more to the banks, then there'd be a bit less de-risking. So we have to address these commercial incentives as well, and recognize that there's a role for other standard setters in terms of setting regulatory expectations across the broader spectrum of banks business and CDD more generally outside of that for AML. So we recognize the issues, we're doing a lot, we recognize there's much more to be done, but we're here, we're part of this dialogue, and I'm very proud of the partnership we've built with Leah, with the World Bank and others on this call today. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, David, and certainly for calling a spade and acknowledging that indeed had NPOs been a bit more profitable and a bit more, in that sense, commercially valuable, we might not be having the same discussion here. I hope that all the NPOs, CSOs on this call heard well your plea and your the information that CSOs are valuable partners in the evaluation process, and they have something, a lot to contribute to evaluators, and those, as David said, those schedules are public. So if you see that a country that either you're based in or you have a lot of knowledge of is being evaluated, do try and get in touch either with the FATF or with one of the local FATF style regional bodies to say, we have something to say here, and try and get onto the agenda. That's a very important point. And I know that Leah and the HSC and a lot of others are trying to do a lot to raise the awareness of that, but I think that's a very important point. We have a tiny bit more minute. Our tech masters were kind and gave us 5 more minutes. So if I haven't seen any comments come in on the chat, Leah, I don't know if you or Sangeeta have seen questions come in from the participants. If not, Ihara, are there any questions that have come in that we can put to the panel members?
Emil, I can't see the questions that have come in. I think Ihara needs to help us here.
Okay, I see. Okay, I see that Ihara just says that no questions have been submitted so far. I don't know, do any of the panel members want to say a few closing words? Leah, do you want to say a few closing words? Otherwise, I will wrap it up.
Very quickly, just to express my thanks to everyone who was on the panel today. I think this network is just quite exceptional, and I think everybody spoke, from his or her heart, but also from, the practice that we need to really fix the problem of de-risking of NPOs. Everyone has agreed on that, and we all have a responsibility and role to play here. So I think, things are happening within banks, with regulators. The FATF is very supportive, has always been supportive on the de-risking issue. And I'm also grateful that the GPFI HITAM has also spoken on the work the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion is committed to engage with NPOs on helping to solve financial access restrictions. And I think all my civil society colleagues have done a great job presenting on what they are doing to help find solutions. And Emil, thank you for facilitating this. We have been working on this for such a long time. I think we'll continue to work on this, and I'm hopeful that we'll have solutions, perhaps technical, but we also need systemic solutions at the policy level, at the highest policy level, and that has to go hand in hand. And I think we all agreed to that this afternoon, this evening, this morning in this panel. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah, and thank you very much to all panelists and discussants for your contributions today. To the participants, rest assured that we will do our best to take the conclusions, not just the framing of the problem, which I think our NPOs friends from civil society helped us do very well and very heartfelt, but also the ways forward, the technological, the toolkit, the business and human rights, what the FATF is doing, what the Global Partnership on Financial Inclusion is doing, the type of NGO source, the repository that is being, we'll try and put those basic conclusions, those basic findings, carry that up and put that to the G20 forum as well, so that we can rest assured that this issue will remain on the international agenda for time to come. I'm getting very stern words now, so I will have to leave it here. Thank you all very much for your attention and participation, and we hope to see you back maybe in this time, in this setting very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.